Hi everyone, welcome to our first video cast for the Thinking and Language unit. Today we're going to focus on thinking, and then the next video cast will be focusing on language. So, what is the components of thought? All right, thinking refers to every mental activity that's associated with knowing, remembering, or communicating something. So it basically refers to a whole big topic in psychology, right? The way that you think about the world is very important. Cognitive psychologists study all these different ways that you think, and they really look for what's logical in the thought process and what's illogical, especially when making decisions and forming judgments and solving problems. So here's some basic components of thought. I'm going to go through each more specifically, but some of them will look familiar to you, like a schema and a cognitive map. Hopefully those look familiar. So the first part of thought is a concept. You know, when you boil thought down to its most basic part, we have a bunch of concepts that make up our understanding of the world around you, right? A concept is a mental grouping of similar objects, events, and people. It helps you to simplify the world. If every single thing had to have its own separate idea, name, whatever, it'd be very confusing. Okay, so an example of a concept is a chair. A chair is something you sit in. It has 4 legs. There's lots of different types of chairs, but if you say a chair, we know what it means. Not every chair has to have its own name. Birds, doctors, same idea, and smart. Smart, you might not think of that as a concept, but it is. Like when I say the word smart, you understand what that means, and I'm able to communicate with you using that concept. There's 3 specific types of concepts. There's a prototype, which is it's the best example of the concept. So for example, if the concept is fruit, the prototype is apple or an orange. If you ask someone for the first fruit that comes to mind, they're going to say apple or orange, even though they know kiwi is a fruit. So prototype is the best example. A formal object or a formal concept is a concept that has specific rules, like a triangle or a square. And a natural concept is something that's more fluid, not so much specific to rules, and it's kind of formed through everyday experiences. So like a dog, right? You learn what the concept of a dog is through seeing them, and they're not all the same. They don't all have the same rules. Okay. A schema is a mental framework that you use to understand the world around you, right? So, an example of a schema might be for an airport, right? You know like what goes on in an airport, what an airline passenger is supposed to do. You have an understanding of how it works. It's a schema. An auto mechanic, right, is another idea here. You have a concept or a schema of how things work, and so you have a schema of it's a mental framework that organizes the information. And a script is it helps you know what to expect in a social situation. Like a script is a set of almost like lines, like in a play. So it's a personal view of how the event will play out, but there's usually similarities from person to person. So an example is like a restaurant. You have a viewpoint of how that conversation will go in the restaurant. You'll sit down, the waiter will come over, ask for drinks, then ask for your food order. There's a way that things work. And it helps you know that what's going to happen next when you go to a restaurant. You're not like totally thrown off every single time you go. Using a library, right? There's a script for how to do that. What's the appropriate noise volume? How do you check out a book? Those kinds of things. And it's generally always the same. You never have to worry about it. A first date, right? There's a script for what's important to talk about on a first date and what's okay and not okay. What's appropriate and inappropriate to say or to ask about on a first date. And there's a way that it goes, right? A guy might pick a girl up, they might meet somewhere, then he might open the door, they might sit down. Like there's a process to these things, right? And sometimes cultures have conflicting schemas and scripts, and so when 2 people don't follow the same script or share the schema for how something like a marriage or a wedding would look, then there might be tension between them because they don't really always know what to expect from the other side. Another example of another way to look at thought or thinking is a mental model of things. So it's just a mental representation, either of an object or a situation. It's like the way that you think that it might happen. If I say a word to you, you're able to imagine what it is, right? You're able to come up with a mental image. A cognitive map is a mental representation of your environment, okay? And this can be in your house, it can be the school, it can be your way to and from your job, any map of the environment. An algorithm is a step-by-step process that will always be the same every single time. It will never change, and it will always get you the exact same formula, the exact same answer, okay? A heuristic is going to be something that you're going to use to get a shortcut to get the answer, right? So in other words, if you're going to use an algorithm for a lock, you're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 3, 3, you're going to 3, 2, 3. You're going to change the numbers, but you're going to use every single number in the order always the same way. And then you're going to change the numbers methodically so that you end up thinking of every single combination possible, right? It's very different than a heuristic. A heuristic is going to be a shortcut. You're not going to use all of that. You're going to figure out what number combinations are most probable. Or if I gave you a word scramble and there was a Y in it, you're automatically going to put the Y at the end because you know that most words end in Y and don't start with Y. So it's a shortcut to solving a problem. There are 2 types of heuristics that tend to really make us generally make bad decisions or think through things incorrectly. And an example of this is, the first one is an availability heuristic. So generally humans tend to think in the first example or information that comes to mind. So if I was to think of like dangerous travel, like how to travel, right? Dangerous methods of travel. I would say like, oh, a plane is definitely the most, like plane crashes are like terrifying. Guess what? Way more cars crash every single day than planes, okay? But because when planes crash, it's like so dramatic, there's so much news coverage, there's all this whatever, you totally freak out about it because that's the information that when you think of something maybe dangerous happening when you're traveling, you think of a plane crash. But actually a car is more dangerous. A representative heuristic is when you tend to make a judgment based on if it matches the stereotype. So if I were to ask you like, who reads more books, Ivy League professors or truck drivers, you might say Ivy League professors. But technically, there's way more truck drivers than Ivy League professors. So statistically, it's more likely that truck drivers on the whole would read more books because there's actually more of them. But that doesn't match your stereotype for a truck driver, so you think Ivy League. So it's the Ivy League guy is representative of who would read a book. It's an example of availability heuristic. People freaked out about the bird flu, right? Like I was like, bird flu, and then there's swine flu, and everyone's like wearing masks because people were dying all over the world, right? People were dying of a whole bunch of other things, way more than they were dying of the bird flu or the swine flu or whatever. But because it was publicized on the news, everyone freaks out about it because it's the first thing that comes to your mind. So think about which of these is more likely to cause death in the United States, and I'll give you the answers in class. All right, problem solving. So you have a means-ends analysis. This is where you focus on the end goal and the sub-steps needed to achieve the goal. Second one is an analogy, finding similarities between current problem and a prior problem. Incubation is like stepping back from the problem and like kind of letting itself work out in your mind. And then insight is when you suddenly have like a realization to the solution. All of a sudden, it's like the aha moment, the light bulb, right? So you can try this on your own. It's called the Tower of Hanoi, and you have to move all the discs from A to C, moving only one disc at a time and never putting a larger one on top of a smaller one. So see if you can figure it out. Creativity, right? Creativity is a process that gives you novel responses. And obviously creativity is really important in thinking because it allows us to understand how people can think differently about the same problem and come up with different solutions. And creativity is a mental and social process involving new ideas or concepts coming to the surface. There's 2 basic types of, we think of like creative thought. There's convergent, which is like everyone thinking about a topic the same way, which isn't very creative, and then divergent, which is everyone thinking about a topic in different ways. And one way people test creativity is by asking how many uses you can think of for a paperclip. And then how many answers you can come up with is kind of, they say it's a window to how creative you are. So you're trying to solve problems, and obviously it's not easy. There's lots of things that get in the way. One of the biggest things is something called a mental set. A mental set is a tendency for you to want to solve a problem in a way that's worked in the past, right? And while that might be great, sometimes it works, but not always, okay? Another example of an obstacle that gets in your way is functional fixedness. And this is your inability to perceive new uses for an object that's not actually what it's made for. So an example of this might be trying to come up with a new use for a toothbrush, or if you forgot a pillow on your camping trip, you might not think to use your jacket, right? Because it's not, jackets aren't pillows, jackets are jackets, right? So the function of the object is fixed in your mind, and you're not able to come up with a new use for it. And a very standardized way that they test this is this candle problem, where they give you a candle and a box and some thumbtacks and some matches, and they ask you to solve the problem. But in order to solve it, you have to come up with a new way to use some of those products. And people generally don't tend to come up with that new way, okay? You can hear Chloe in there barking. She's not happy. She doesn't want to come up with a new way. So this is an example of a mental set here. It's like the idea that you go around all the time maybe pushing or pulling on doors. So when you push or pull, you get to the door and you go to push and it's a pull because it's not the way that you always solve problems, right? It's not the problem of opening the door, so you feel confused. I do that all the time. I'll totally admit that. Okay, here's a couple of things that get in the way of making decisions and that you use quite frequently when making decisions, so there are things to be aware of. First one is confirmation bias. We've talked about this. It's when you only look for things that fit with what you already know. So if I think that choosing my answers or changing my answers on a test is like, I always go with your gut, right? So that's what I think. And then I change an answer and then I get my test back and I'm like, oh, I got it wrong. See, whenever I change my answer, I always get it wrong. Well, technically, you've probably changed your answer a ton of times and gotten it right, but you don't even remember or care. Statistically, you're better off changing your answer, but confirmation bias makes you only remember the times that you changed it and got it wrong. Okay, and here's an example of the full moon and, that you think that, students are more negative or whatever during the full moon, but that's really because you only pay attention then, right? Overconfidence. This is the idea, I've talked about this, that you tend to think you know more than you actually do. That's why when you take a test or you study for a test, you can't just read over your notes. You actually have to quiz yourself because you're reading like, yeah, I know this. Oh, yeah, I know this. You don't know it, right? And you tend to overestimate how accurate you are too. So you always have to test yourself. The next one is belief perseverance. And this is the idea that once you have a belief about something, it is very hard to change it because you tend to cling to your initial conception even if it's wrong and it's been proven that it's wrong. A great example of this is Obama's birth certificate. People are still set on the fact that Obama was not born in the United States even after the proof came out that he has, his birth certificate shows that and he is a citizen of the United States and was born here. They hold on to that belief. And the last thing that can come into effect when making a decision is framing. So generally, and companies use this a lot, they know that they can change your decision about a product by the way that they frame their their company wording or the percentages of the product. So here's an example. If a company wants to sell you something, they're not going to say it has 20% fat. They're going to say it's 80% lean meat, right? Who's going to buy 20% fat? No one, but 80% lean. You're like, oh, great, 80% lean, perfect. Another example of this is condoms or contraception, right? If on the box of contraception it said that there's a 5% failure rate for HIV, everyone's going to be like, what? That's terrible. But if it says 95% success rate in preventing HIV, that looks pretty good. So that's a big difference, but it's actually the exact same set of information, okay? Now, I want you to think to yourself, would you rather gain $20 or lose $30? Think about it, and I'll tell you the answer in class. That's all for now, AP Psychos, and remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.